Good evening, my name is Mr. Jackabee. Tonight I have a story for all those who are looking a house of their own. About 5 years ago, my wife Jane and I decided that it was finally time to start looking to purchase a house. We had always talked about buying an older fixer-upper home. You know, one of those houses that are cheap, run down, but love to love and care. Because we've had the idea that they hold more charm and character. Plus we can appreciate a place that has its own quirks, and we love the thought of turning something run down into something beautiful again. With that being said, I grew up in a pretty rural farming town in Indiana that had more than its fair share of rundown houses. The surrounding areas had started to boom a little bit, with farmland being sold off and turned into new factory locations, along with subdivisions for the people coming to work in them. I thought it'd be a great place to start on our house hunt. I figured we'd be a lot closer to civilization than I used to be growing up, but not so much that we'd be living a stone's throw from our neighbours. Jane and I decided to take a drive one summer afternoon so I could show her some of the back roads of my hometown, and to also see what some of the properties we checked out online looked like in person. As we were turning off the main road through a town and further onto a more secluded country road, we noticed that the very first house on the left was completely abandoned. We pulled onto a small patch of the yard where the grass was the shortest and where the gravel drive used to be. To further investigate this, it was painted a deep green colour which made it almost invisible against the tall grass, sticker bushes and weeds that had grown up around it over time. There was a massive tree in the front yard whose branches and leaves helped to camouflage this place even further. The house looked as if it was at least 100 years old. It looked like it had sat empty for years. It looked neglected, weather-worn and in need of major love. In that moment, it was perfect. There was nothing but woods across the street and no neighbouring houses in sight, so Jane and I thought it probably wouldn't hurt if we just trespassed just a little. I completely justified my reasoning by thinking, well, we're interested in buying this property. We're not here to cause any trouble. We're doing someone a favour, and we could take this burden of a house off someone else's hands. We just needed to take a look around first, that's all. Plus, there weren't any no trespassing signs anywhere, so I was perfectly armed with my newfound inflated ignorance and arrogance to assess this property. We walked carefully through the bush towards the left side of the house, where we noticed a well that was still standing, complete with bucket, rope handle and the original overhang. My excitement for a picturesque country house was building. Directly across from the well there was a side entrance into the house through what looked like an added-on mudroom. The screen door on the mudroom was closed, however. There was a wooden door behind it that was half open. This was not really intrusive because we aren't breaking anything to get way in. It was probably in the mid-50s or 90s outside that day, so when we entered Jane first, of course, we were met with a thick, stifling heat. The kind that holds so much humidity that it almost takes your breath away. What we thought was a mud room was an extended pantry area, a canning kitchen. It was tiny with one window, an old rusted sink, a small stove, and the wall still held shelves upon shelves of canned, but spoiled, vegetables in jars. I remember thinking, oh yeah, this will be great. I totally remember how to can, and we can have a garden of sorts. It also had the doorway into the main part of the house, and this is where my elation came to an end. Through the doorway was the kitchen. What remained of the cabinets and sink were against the wall on the left, but they were either broken or hanging on for dear life, or both. The kitchen connected to a wide open living area, with one side having walls streaked with black that led up to halfway to the grey ceiling. There had been a fire at some point. The windows on that wall were filthy, covered in dust or ash that made the room much darker than it should have been in the middle of the day. My heart sank. I knew we wouldn't be able to afford a costly repair of the house fire, but I kept that disappointing thought to myself. The open area had not one stitch of furniture, save for one small wooden rocking horse that a child would have had. The floor was littered with magazines, as if someone had a giant stack of them and just threw them in the air to see where they would land. Curious as to what the former owners liked in regards to reading materials, I decided to check them out. Almost every single magazine was related to dolls in some way. Porcelain doll collecting, Barbie dolls, making dolls by hand, clothing for dolls. I felt a little creeped out by it, especially under the surveillance of the rocking horse's dead painted on stair. But I figured that an old lady must have lived in the house before, and I created a self-medicated idea that her husband probably died, and this was the only hobby she had to pass her time. We decided to check out another room that was connected to the half-burned living room. Through the doorway to the left was a weird combination of a moulded stand-up shower with handicap handles, an assisted toilet next to it divided down the middle by a wall. On the right was a wall made entirely of built-in bookshelves. The shelves were full of paperwork, manila envelopes, books, and even more magazines. It struck us as a pretty weird setup, but thought these people must have really loved to read while sitting on the toilet. My wife and I thought we could find out who the previous owners were, since some of the paperwork on the top of the stack seemed to be old bills. If we wanted to look up property records, at least now we would have had a name to go on. I grabbed a stick of papers and began to flip through them. Even about halfway through, they changed from being old telephone bills to printed out coloured pictures on the internet of porcelain dolls. I put the stack of papers back on the shelf and picked up a small red 5-star notebook. I started from the beginning, casually leafing through, seeing daily entries of medications taken, blood pressure and glucose measurements written in a neat hand. About 20 pages in, the entries started to change entirely. They became crude drawings of twisted faces done in red ink. The faces had horns or bloody fangs. Then full-on drawings of devils appeared in the pages after. I wanted to believe that a child had picked this up to doodle in, but I felt like this was something much different than that. After the drawings, the notebook became someone's personal journal, written in what I assumed was an elderly man's cursive. It told of how he knew he was coming towards the end of his life, and how he remembered being just a young boy when his mother passed away. He described in detail how the wake for his mother was held in the front room of his home, and how during those nights he crawled on top of his mother's body in her coffin to sleep. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Even though I had been sweating from the thickness in the air, a sudden rush of goosebumps came over me. I immediately showed it to Jane, flipping to the pages of the devils and the snarl faces, and then read aloud the stranger's memories of his mother just to see if it was the same as the second time round. After I finished, she said, "Well, this has just got a whole lot weirder," nodding to what she held in her hand. While I was reading the notebook, she had continued rifling through the mountains of papers. One stack not only had more printed pictures of dolls, but now they contained pictures of real women in torture bondage, ball gags or electrical tape placed over their mouths, jumper cables twisting their nipples, being hog-tied with rope. Sometimes there was more than one woman in the picture. It felt as if a brick had been tossed into my stomach. For some, those images would be disturbing, but in the context of our visit, my panic was starting to grow. I was torn between wanting to find out more and getting the hell out. Jane assured me that while it was on the creepy side, it wasn't anything to necessarily lose my head over, since the woman didn't seem to be suffering or bleeding. The burned out living area was separated from the rest of the house by a staircase. The staircase had a room directly across it, and a small hallway on the other side that led to the main room at the front of the house. We debated on going up to the second floor, but decided against it, since it already felt as if it were roasting in an oven, where we were unsure of the stability on the second floor. Going into the room across the staircase, we noticed a few more doll magazines on the floor, but not near the number as the other room held. There were scattered plastic doll pieces here and there, random arms and heads, legs and torsos. To the left was the original fireplace with a couple of tiny vases on the mantel. Smack dab in the middle was a framed picture of an elderly couple, smiling and happy. These certainly weren't the type of people who would have pictures of women bound and gagged hidden away in their bathroom. These people could have been my grandparents, I thought to myself. To the right was a big bay window, and smack dab in the middle was a yellowed piece of paper which faded back black, printed handwriting on it, and it was for anyone on the outside of the house to see, before it had been overgrown, of course. Reading it backwards from inside, it says, "If you're here to talk about Jesus, go away." "That's kind of hilarious," Jane said after reading it for herself. "Yeah, it is," I half chuckled, but something in my brain was now starting to nag me even more. Something wasn't computing correctly for me. Thinking back, my mind was putting together that an elderly couple in this town would more than likely be pretty religious, and by the super small chance that they weren't, it would have been gossiped about, and had someone seen that in the window, it was as if the house had held two different people and two different personalities within it. I told my wife that I just wanted to go into the one last room down the little hallway, then I would be very ready to go and leave this house once and for all. Going down the small hallway, it became darker and cooler. It was a relief from the oppressive heat that we had been dealing with since first stepping inside. The shade from the giant tree in front of the yard had blocked out a lot of sunlight, making it about 20 degrees cooler. But we soon realised that it wasn't the only reason this part of the house temperature was much more tolerable. Rounding the corner into the last room, it took a few seconds for our eyes to adjust to the difference in light. But the change of the air was noticeable immediately. It was as if we had stepped into a cave. The smell was dank and left a dampness on our skin. Once things became into clear focus, that's when we saw it. The main reason our senses had shifted so quickly, the large hole in the floor. At first we thought that perhaps the wooden floor was so weak it had simply caved in on its own, or that the roof had leaked and caused the exact area of the floor to rot away. But upon getting closer, it became obvious that this wasn't the case. The hole was about 5 foot across and went straight down into the earth, with about 2.5 feet of space between the remaining floor and the dirt. This hole was there because it was made to be there. My wife and I looked at each other. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it would burst through my chest. I said loud to her while pointing, "What the hell is this? Why is this here?" I panicked. My breathing became more rapid and shallow. Nothing was making sense, and yet the thoughts that had been running into the background of my brain were all coming together just like a jigsaw puzzle. Then we saw them, the worn and faded social security cards, a few old and moulded over driver's licenses, just thrown around haphazardly, checkbooks, credit cards, personal items, as if someone had emptied their pockets or purses and wallets into this room and then just disappeared into the hole. I was overcome with terror and dread. I had to get out of this house. My skin felt like static, as if my whole body had been taken over by the sensation of when your foot falls asleep. I had tears forming in my eyes, and my mind just told me to run. Without to speak, Jane quickly took me by the arm and led us back down the hallway, through the burned out living room and kitchen, and out inside the canning room and back out into the light of the day. We ran back down the mangled and tangled driveway to the car. Remembering back, I get the eerie feeling that we weren't the only two people in the house that day, alive or dead. Just a side note, I thought, when one day, this house still stands. We never called the police to report us breaking into this house and finding a giant hole in the floor. However, we drove past it about a year later, and the large tree in front of the house had all its branches removed. All the windows had been boarded shut, and after doing some research found out that the land it sits on is for sale. The house itself had been condemned. The picture we saw in the house and the house itself never left my mind. Many years later, while in an RB, I did some searching and found some information on this house. This house, to my amazement and shock, was once owned by a Mr. and Mrs. Peterborough. They were boarding house owners, and people used to frequent the boarding house on their way through, businessmen, travellers, people on holiday. Nothing much was ever said about them, but apparently they disappeared one night and were never seen again. I wonder why.